A national emergency for the wall. Donald Trump's unprecedented step to stop migrants at the Mexican border. Will the US president's campaign promise push America towards a constitutional crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. After making threats for months, Donald Trump has finally declared the US-Mexico border a national emergency. This will allow the US president to bypass Congress and divert government funds towards his much-vaunted border wall. The decision is drawing widespread criticism, with senior Democrats and Republicans accusing him of gross abuse of power. Al Jazeera's Kimberly Halkett reports now from Washington.
Fulfilling a 2016 presidential campaign promise in a most unconventional way.
I'm going to be signing a national emergency.
After the U.S. Congress refused this week to approve President Trump's request for $5.7 billion to build a wall along the U.S. southern border, Trump circumvented the legislative body. By declaring a national emergency, Trump now has access to $8 billion, already approved by Congress, to build 376 kilometers of wall to stop illegal immigration, even though the White House won't say exactly where.
We want to stop drugs from coming into our country. We want to stop criminals and gangs from coming into our country.
His Democratic opponents in Congress say the crisis is manufactured and motivated by racism. There's concern about this February 10th Trump tweet. He argues a wall is needed to stop the influx of 42 million Latin Americans into the United States, something Trump says would be a disaster. Opponents are vowing to overturn what they say is the president's power grab and defend Congress's constitutional authority to decide how taxpayer money is spent through legislation and in the courts. But Trump is pushing back, arguing other presidents have also made emergency declarations to achieve political goals, like President George W. Bush, who made similar declarations after the September 11th attacks. Those continue to this day. Trump's already anticipating legal challenges, but he expects to prevail in the courts, as he points out he did when his ban on travelers entering the United States from some Muslim-majority countries was also challenged.
We will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, even though it shouldn't be there. And we will possibly get a bad ruling, and then we'll get another bad ruling, and then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake, and we'll win in the Supreme Court.
But the legal and legislative challenges will be long and lengthy, with presidential campaigning already underway. Donald Trump's attempt to keep a 2016 campaign promise has become a 2020 presidential campaign issue as well. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, the White House.
We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, let's have a look at whether an emergency situation really does exist at the US-Mexico border. The number of undocumented migrants crossing the border is at a 20-year low, and a wall won't stop them crossing at official points of entry to request asylum. Trump's promising that the wall will stop the flow of drugs, but government data shows that 80 to 90% of heroin, cocaine and methamphetamine is trafficked through official entry points, with marijuana the only exception. The president also made bold claims about the murder rate in America, saying that thousands of lives would be lost if he didn't act. But there's little evidence linking crime and immigration. Let's bring in our guests then, all of whom join us from Washington, D.C. Charles Moran is a Republican political strategist and former delegate for President Trump in 2016. Jeff Hauser, an executive director of the Revolving Door Project at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And Bruce Fein, political analyst and former U.S. Associate Deputy Attorney General. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Charles Moran, border crossing apprehensions fell to a 46-year low in 2017, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection figures. Estimated undetected illegal border crossings dropped by more than 90% in the 10 years to 2016. That's according to the Department of Homeland Security. So where's the national emergency?
Thanks for having me on this morning, Adrian. I think part of what President Trump is trying to enunciate is the fact that we have an ongoing threat that can spark up at any time at our southern border. While those facts are correct, and President Trump has done a very good job trying to discourage people from coming into this country illegally, we've seen movements, especially from Central America, those migrant caravans and groups of people who have been amassing at the southern border. These are situations that can develop very quickly and very rapidly, where our existing protocols for dealing with people who are seeking asylum or people who are trying to use that movement to try to unlawfully gain entry into our country.
Hang on a minute, Charles. Isn't it the case that many of the migrants who are on the move from Central America towards the US border are choosing to stay in Mexico, having been offered asylum and work permits by the Mexican government? And as you heard a few moments ago, most illegal drugs come through official ports of entry.
Well, again, while people are being processed and asked to stay in Mexico, this was not necessarily the policy that existed before President Trump and our immigration system, asked people to stay in Mexico. Mind you, people can apply for asylum in their home countries. All of the countries where these people from the migrant caravans are coming from do have embassies and consulates from America in those countries where they can apply for asylum in exactly the same way. Mind you, they're also not taking the most direct route to America. They're going all the way to California versus going to the closest port of entry or the closest border crossings, which would be in Texas. So there's clearly some calculation going on behind this to go into some areas versus others.
All right, Jeff Hauser, what do you make of that? There's an ongoing threat at the southern border that could spark up at any time.
I don't think that the threat that Donald Trump was responding to had anything to do with migrants fleeing disastrous situations in Central America. I think the threat to Donald Trump was that far-right commentators like Sean Hannity and Ann Coulter and others on the nationalist fringe of American politics have been calling President Trump's bluff. He had failed to produce the wall that he had promised so widely in 2016. They had forgiven him for the outlandish claim that he was going to make Mexico pay for the wall. Everyone's kind of just acknowledged that was not true and moved past that. But in late December, President Trump was about to sign a reasonable continuing resolution that did not include funding for the wall. He got some anger from the far right. And all of a sudden, the last 6 weeks, he's been in panic mode that he has to produce a wall. And that he feels a political emergency that is not borne out by any realities facing the American people at the U.S. border with Mexico.
Bruce Fein, I see you sitting there smirking as you're listening. Is the declaration of a national emergency going to enable President Trump to build his wall?
Yeah, no. I mean, perhaps the best witness is the president himself. Yesterday he said, I didn't need to do it. That's his words. That's the opposite of the definition of a national emergency. He didn't need to do it. The fact is there will be lawsuits filed immediately by owners of land that will be tried to be taken by eminent domain. There'll be state attorney general lawsuits. I believe the House Democrats will bring a lawsuit as well, claiming that their power over appropriations has been usurped by the president. It's the same tactic the Republicans used when they are in the control of the House to challenge President Obama's spending under the Affordable Care Act, monies that hadn't been appropriated by Congress. In addition, under the National Emergencies Act, both the House and the Senate have expedited procedures for disapproving the emergency declarations by majority vote. President Trump could veto that, but the likelihood of an override is substantial, surely in the House, possibly in the Senate. And the fact is it will lose in the courts for certain. Now, why did he do that, knowing that the chances of success were very diminished? And that is because he'll be able to tell his supporters, hey, the court stopped me, or Congress did. I still attempted to fulfill my campaign pledge. And I think for those supporters, they don't really care whether there was a wall. They just care that Mr. Trump attempted and to thumb his nose at our constitutional dispensation to build a wall without convincing Congress it was necessary.
Charles Moran, the president will lose in the courts for certain. Will he prevail in the courts?
Adrian, I just want to clear up something here. The money has already been appropriated by Congress. These are pots of money that exist in various areas of the government, mostly come out of the Department of Defense for discretionary projects like this. The money exists. Congress can't go back and retroactively disagree with the money that they've already appropriated to these different departments for their own projects. The president has the authority to go ahead and readjust the direction of that money, but it already has been appropriated. This is completely legal. While people can be unhappy whether or not this is conservative enough, whether or not it's constitutionally balanced between, you know, the executive branch and in the Congress, that's fine. But Congress passed this resolution in the 70s that gave the president of the United States this executive power, and it can't necessarily just disagree. I mean, President Obama, President Bush beforehand, you know, this has been used 58 times since 1979. I mean, it's Charles, there for a reason.
The law doesn't say what constitutes a national emergency. I mean, how are you going to persuade the courts to rule that President Trump might have exceeded or not exceeded his authority in this case?
Well, it is his authority. He is the commander-in-chief. He is at a place where we've got, you know, again, these pools of money that are in departments that he controls. He has the authority under this law that lets him direct this and declare an emergency. This is totally constitutionally valid. Not only the fact that, I don't know what TV shows you were watching over the last several months, but I remember thousands and thousands and thousands of people amassing at our borders, a pure humanitarian crisis that was going on, and a national security crisis. National security is something that I think kind of trumps a lot of some of these concerns that people are having, especially in the run in the Democratic Congress. At this point, President Trump is making the argument that this is a national security issue, and that justifies the use of this national emergency crisis clause.
Bruce, I know you want to come in. If George W. Bush can do it, why can't Donald Trump?
It depends upon the facts and circumstances. I was there at the Pentagon Papers case. The Nixon administration said it's national security that we prevent the Washington Post and New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers. The court said, no, it's not a national emergency. Harry Truman, during the Korean War, said it's a national emergency, national security, that I prevent steel strikes to build tanks that can go fight in Korea. Supreme Court said no in this Youngstown state. Sorry, that's not a national emergency. A national emergency is not whatever the president says it is, you know, like Humpty Dumpty saying a word means whatever I want it to mean. And again, this is President Trump's own words. I didn't have to do it. It can't be an emergency if you don't need to do it. Emergency, by definition, means it's got to be reacted to immediately. And lastly, with regard to the powers of Congress, Congress appropriates money for particular purposes. It doesn't just appropriate money, throw it in a pot, and says, President, you spend with it how you see. If it appropriates money, you know, to build levees on the Mississippi River, the president can't use it to build a wall, because to comply with the law, you have to use it for the purpose specified by Congress. And insofar as Congress would be foolish enough to just give a pot of money to the president and say, you spend it however you want, it would probably be an unconstitutional delegation. The power of the person spending, the framers said, is the most important power Congress is endowed with. It enables it to check presidential abuses. And Trump is basically saying it means nothing. Once you appropriate money for any purpose, I can go build a wall anytime I want without any congressional authority. The last thing, and I apologize here, Congress can change its mind at any time. What it gives away, it can repeal the next day. It's not bound once it decides to stick with it forever.
Jeff Hauser, if this business of Congress having already appropriated the funds, if they're diverted away from the Department of Defense or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in order to build President Trump's wall, what could the knock-on effect be?
I mean, there are a couple knock-on effects. There's the short-run effect that there is money that is allocated to the Defense Department to build things, because obviously the military is a large builder of facilities for military bases and the like. And there is power in the case of an actual emergency that can be addressed by the military construction to use money. But because there is no emergency generally, and there is certainly no military emergency, I mean, these caravans that Charles is referring to are slow-moving groups of people from Central America with which Fox News analysts embed themselves to provide hourly reports to Fox News' audience about the slow march of women and children from Central America through Mexico for a month at a time. These are hardly dangerous people, certainly not a military emergency. So that's the short run, that there is absolutely no money appropriated for this purpose, and courts will find that. But the bigger picture emergency concern is that if you were to have Trump appointee judges to in any way validate this action by the president, you are unsettling, as Bruce was suggesting, the constitutional order of the United States, the supremacy of Congress with respect to the power of the purse. And the effects of that would be enormous. And I would suspect that the effects would be considerable even if a Democrat were president. And that's why ultimately I think Chief Justice John Roberts is unlikely to validate this action by Donald Trump, because he could foresee that if the emergency powers that were allocated to the president for very narrow and specific purposes could be abused so broadly as they would be here, that the ripple effects on issues like gun control and climate change would be tremendous and very much to the dissatisfaction of Republicans.
What's to stop, Charles, a future... sorry, Bruce, let me just put a question to Charles and we'll come back to you in a second. Yeah. What's to stop a future Democratic president using emergency powers or a state of emergency to take action on climate change, on gun control? Doesn't this set a dangerous precedent for Donald Trump?
Well, I think this legislation is dangerous inherently. I mean, I think that there's a lot of conservatives who are making the case, clearly that they don't agree with the president's use of this law to take this type of action. And clearly, just as was mentioned before, Congress can change its mind. If they want to repeal this law, they absolutely have the right to. And I would invite a full review of, again, the executive branch versus the constitutional branch of our government, the legislative. I think that this law has been used entirely too many times in the past. It probably does need to be reviewed, and that there is a constitutional responsibility over the power of the purse. But at the end of the day, this law exists. It is in force now. It has been used. It is going to be continued. It is being used by President Trump to address what he considers a national security crisis. Democrats refused to deal with this in good faith. President Trump reopen the government, sign the legislation to get people back to work. Democrats don't care about the issues. They just care about Donald Trump. And at the end of the day, this has nothing to do with national security. This is Democrats grandstanding because they know that they have a bit of power now. And in this situation, I think a review going forward of this law is probably quite justified. And I would invite Democrats and Republicans to limit the overreach by the executive branch going forward. But that's legislation that would have to be taken up in Congress, debated and passed. And that doesn't solve the crisis that we're dealing with now.
Bruce, what do you make of that? Democrats don't care about the issues, they care about Donald Trump.
First, well, they do, and I'm not denying that. All Washington is politics here. There are ulterior motives, even if they may coincide with the public good from time to time. But remember, here we have a situation where Mitch McConnell, the majority leader Republican in the Senate, advised the president not to go forward. So there are conservative Republicans who are very worried about this exercise of presidential limitless authority. Secondly, there is a law. The National Emergencies Act itself, 1976, provides expedited parliamentary treatment of resolutions in the House and the Senate to disapprove a declaration of national emergency. And I expect we will get votes out of the House and Senate doing that. The president may veto that, and then we'll have an override issue. But the last thing with regard to the claim of national emergency powers here, President George W. Bush confronted a similar kind of issue. And in 2006, Congress passed the Fence Act. They appropriated money to build some physical barriers, but they utilized the immigration laws. It wasn't a national security issue where the military is brought out. And I believe under the Anti-Deficiency Act, if the president knowingly spends money for a purpose not appropriated by Congress, that is a crime. Now, because he's a sitting president, Mr. Mueller probably couldn't prosecute him, but it certainly could be an impeachable offense. Secondly, under the Posse Comitatus Act, insofar as the military is being used to address enforcement of the immigration laws, which by and large are civil violations, you get deported, that also could be a criminal violation of use of the military for an improper purpose. So Mr. Trump is skating very close to the edge here. and taking what I believe is a reckless decision, not because I do believe he thinks it's going to work. It's simply, as was pointed out earlier, because he wants to placate the vocal conservatives like Mr. Hannity and Ann Coulter for 2020. I don't even believe he cares whether he wins or loses in the court. He just wants to rally his troops.
Jeff Hauser, the public doesn't appear to be with the president. A recent CNN poll found that 65% of Americans on average opposed the president's national emergency. He says he's fulfilling an election promise, but if he presses ahead with only 32% support for this national emergency, that could hurt him in 2020, couldn't it? Is this, do you think, a sign of weakness on President Trump's part?
I absolutely think it's a sign of weakness. I think that there are two concurrent political dilemmas facing the president. One is, how does he make sure that Republicans who are facing Republican primaries want to be seen as supporting the president? And that's the base strategy. That is the retain dominance within the Republican Party. And this seems to be a move in that front. This means that if you, 32% probably reflects 80 or 90% of people who would vote in a Republican primary, which is unfortunate, but that means that it's going to be somewhat difficult for principled conservative Republicans in the U.S. Senate and the House to oppose Donald Trump. I think many of them will do so on this matter, but it is definitely going to be difficult for them. But it does undermine the other political challenge for President Trump, which is actually winning re-election in 2020. So I think why he is prioritizing his base, why he wants to make the 30% very happy with him, is that he is facing challenges between now and fall of 2020, and he'll deal with fall of 2020 in the fall of 2020. He wants to make sure that his dominance of the Republican Party is secure between now and then. And I think that issues, including the Mueller investigation, as well as just Democratic investigations in the House of Representatives, must be making him very afraid. And so his view is to double down on his control of the Republican Party so that even if Democrats move very aggressively against him, even if Robert Mueller moves very aggressively against him, so that he can count on a consolidated Republican base behind him so that Republicans will not join Democrats in opposing Trump over issues like Mueller.
Charles, with an eye on 2020, I could do the wall over a longer period of time, the president said in the Rose Garden on Friday. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster. So by his own admission, this isn't an emergency. He's just frustrated and impatient. Are those off-cuff remarks going to come back and haunt him, both politically in 2020 and legally?
I just want to go back to what you just said about frustrated and impatient. The people who are frustrated or impatient are the American people. Democrats and Republicans have been kicking the can down the road for decades with immigration reform. President Obama completely left office without dealing with comprehensive immigration reform. Even the Republican Congress in the last session did not effectively deal with comprehensive immigration reform. Chuck Schumer, if we don't forget, shut down the government over immigration issues. What's really coming back to roost here is President Trump is going to address this issue and is taking it head on in a way that has not been seen by any leadership of the Democratic or Republican Party within recent history. President Trump knows that he's taking a risk, just as he took a risk by shutting the government down the first time over this issue. His polling numbers were at 52% just a couple of days ago. Whether or not you agree or disagree with the President of the United States on the action he's taking concerning this executive action and declaring an emergency, President Trump is bringing very closely the issue that we have a broken immigration system in America, and Democrats are just playing football with it for political issues to score with their left.
We're almost out of time. Bruce, if you could wrap it all up for us. I mean, the President is showing leadership here.
Well, our system isn't based upon limitless power in the executive. One of the virtues of the United States Constitution is we have checks and balances. And if you can't get a consensus out of Congress, the constitutional legal thing to do is nothing until you do get that consensus. It isn't, well, we can't get something to happen, so we'll just violate the rules. That is the greatest danger of all here. The president says, oh, we have logjam in the Congress, I'll just do it on my own. No, you got to get a better argument and convince Congress, because otherwise the whole constitutional system collapses.
I have a phone and a pen. Barack Obama said the same thing. I have a phone and a pen. Barack Obama said the same thing, and
he was wrong, and Mr. Obama was wrong then. Mr. Obama was wrong then, and Mr. Trump is equally wrong.
OK, gentlemen, there we must end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Charles Moran, Jeff Hauser, Bruce Fein, and as always, thank you for watching the programme. Don't forget, you can see it again at any time just by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.